discussed his research studies showing with low carbohydrate diets, showing how effective they were to solve obesity. And Gordon said this, and it was true then, it's true today. It may be stated categorically that the storage of fat and therefore the production and maintenance of obesity cannot take place unless glucose is being metabolized. Since glucose cannot be used by most tissues without the presence of insulin, it may also be stated categorically that obesity is impossible in the absence of adequate tissue concentrations of insulin. Thus, an abundant supply of carbohydrate foods exerts a powerful influence in directing the stream of glucose metabolism into lipogenesis, whereas a relatively low carbohydrate intake tends to minimize the storage of fat. And the interesting thing is, for 150 years at least, the conventional wisdom was that carbohydrates make you fat. My mother grew up that eating bread, pasta, and potatoes literally makes her fat. People believe that beer literally makes people fat, that these foods are uniquely fattening. So what you had was this conventional wisdom. Here's how Tolstoy put in Anna Karenina in the 1870s. He's got Vronsky, his protagonist, goes to the races at Krasno Selo. He had come earlier than usual to eat beefsteak in the officers' mess of the regiment. He had no need to be in strict training, as he had very quickly been brought down to the required weight of 160 pounds, but still he had to avoid gaining weight, and he avoided starchy foods and desserts. The idea was that starchy foods were fattening and other foods were not. I mean, this is how Brooke put it in The Importance of Overweight, her seminal book in 1957. She was talking about research done in the 19th century. She said the great progress in dietary control of obesity was a recognition that meat, quote, the strong food, was not fat-producing, but that it was innocent foodstuffs such as bread and sweets which lead to obesity. Passmore, who was the co-author of the seminal dietetics book in England that was written in the 1960s. In the British Journal of Nutrition, he had an article that started, "Every woman knows that carbohydrates are fattening." So what happens? We come along with this idea that dietary fat causes heart disease. And if dietary fat causes heart disease, then we're going to tell people to eat carbohydrate-rich diets. Okay, that's why the food pyramid, the base of the food pyramid for the past 20 years, the USDA Food Guide pyramid, is all the carbohydrates that my mother grew up believing was fattening. But it's fascinating. Remember in 1965, I told you the American Physiological Society puts out this 500-page textbook saying carbohydrates is driving insulin, is driving fat. 1965, the New York Times, the researchers started reading this, doctors started reading this, people like you started reading this research and saying, well, if carbohydrates make us fat, let's see what happens when we don't eat them. So, new diet decried by nutritionists, dangers are seen in low carbohydrate intake. This is a New York Times article. It is a medical fact that no dieter can lose weight unless he cuts down on excess calories, either by taking in fewer of them or by burning them up in exercise. Okay, that's not a medical fact. We know that now, but they didn't know it. Because the diet sharply reduces carbohydrates, which make up 45% of the average American's daily caloric intake, it naturally leads to a proportional, even quantitative increase in the intake of protein and fat. If you eat less carbs, you eat more protein and fat, and mostly more fat, and that's why the Atkins diet was a high-fat diet, and still is. So it's the fat increase that prompted Dr. Jean Mayer of Harvard, the most prominent nutritionist in the United States in the 1960s and 70s, to say that encouraging the diet for middle-aged Americans is, quote, in a sense equivalent to mass murder. So the science tells you that carbohydrates literally make you fat, and the most prominent nutritionist in the United States, because of this belief in the lipid hypothesis, is telling you that if you tell your patients to eat less carbs, it's the equivalent of mass murder. It's like saying cigarettes cause lung cancer, but if you tell your patients not to smoke, you're putting people out of work in South Carolina. Where did this science go? This is the same thing. You look at the textbooks. What makes fat tissues fat? High blood glucose elicits. This is Leninger's Principle of Biochemistry, the 2008 edition. High blood glucose elicits the release of insulin, which speeds the uptake of glucose by tissues, favors the storage of fuels as glycogen and triglycerols, while inhibiting fatty acid mobilization in adipose tissue. Insulin makes fat tissue fat, and we stimulate insulin release by raising our blood sugar by eating carbs. But what about people? To a first approximation, obesity is a result of taking in more calories in the diet than are expended by the body's energy-consuming activities. So what makes fat tissue fat is carbohydrates. What makes people fat? Well, we eat too much. I don't have time for the clinical evidence. I'm 10 minutes past already. Let me see if I have a summary here. Summary. This is what I want to leave you with. there's one thing you take away to your patients, obesity is sort of fat accumulation, not energy balance. Fat accumulation is regulated fundamentally by insulin and dietary carbohydrates. Carbohydrate is driving insulin, is driving fat. It's unfortunate, but it's true, okay? Increasing fat accumulation will cause compensatory increases in energy intake or decrease in expenditure. If people are putting on weight as fat, if they're predisposed to get fat, if children are getting fatter, they will want to eat more and they will want to be sedentary, okay? But you cannot force them to exercise or force them to eat less because their bodies will compensate. What's driving it is the effect of the nutrients on the insulin on their fat tissue. If you want to make them not fat, you have to get rid of the cause. You can't address the side effects. And the only non-pharmaceutical remedy is to restrict the causative agent, the carbohydrates. Thank you very much for your patience. I apologize for running long. If there's any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Thank you. Yeah, the question was about diurnal variations in insulin and whether, I mean, it's interesting. One of the things we do, insulin secretion goes down. It goes basically, it goes up during the day when we're eating, and it goes down at night when we're not. And the system is designed, quite frankly, so that during the day we store fat, and during the night we lose it, and we live off it. And there was a brilliant French physiologist named Jacques Lamagnan who did these studies in rats, where he said, in effect, what we're trying to do, what you want to do is balance over the course of 24 hours the fat you store and the fat you burn over long periods of time. But if you chronically increase insulin levels, as happens in metabolic syndrome, you increase the amount of time that you're storing fat and you decrease the amount of time that you're burning it. So this balance, and again, we know from looking at those numbers, you only have to offset, only have to put 20 calories too much extra into the fat tissue every day to have this effect lead to obesity over the course of 10, 20, 30 years. So the idea is the chronic elevation of insulin, which could indeed, by the way, be caused initially by fructose, throws off this 24-hour cycle of insulin going up and coming down, of us storing fat during the day and burning fat at night. You also burn fat in between meals. But again, because nobody's paid attention to this kind of idea, since we've been so set on this overeating hypothesis, it's one of many things that, if in an ideal world, people would study. There's a lot of the answers to questions people ask me are, I don't know, because we never bothered to look, because we've been obsessed with trying to get people to eat less and exercise more.
But does 10 grams of carbohydrate have the same insulin release, does it prompt the same insulin release, the same amount of insulin at 10 a.m. as at 8 p.m. at night?
The question was, will 10 grams of carbohydrates prompt the same insulin release at 10 a.m. as it will at 8 p.m. at night? And the answer is, I have no idea. But the NIH cared enough to fund such studies, it would be interesting to find out. A lot of people believe that if they eat earlier in the day, which makes sense, their insulin levels will come down earlier, they'll burn fat for longer periods of time, and they won't gain weight. The counter-argument is that the French, who did not have an obesity problem until recently, eat very late in the day and eat small. So it's sort of, who knows? It would be nice to study.
Fatter after introducing what was essentially a Western diet, or a diet really high in carbs that was also a direct result of poverty. And today we see the same epidemiologic relationship between poverty and obesity, and so I think there is still something to this kind of toxic environment where the advertisements for food that kids are getting exposed to at age 2, at age 1, are for high fructose corn syrup soft drink, and they are for high carbohydrate Cheetos.
Right. Well, this is Exactly. It is a toxic environment. The question is, what is a toxic environment? The modern way to look at it is to say the toxic environment is the Western diet, or what I forget what SAD stands for. Standard American Diet, is that it? This is what the Paleolithic diet people like to call it. And obviously, there's something that makes these populations fat. The question is, everything? Is it that they're sedentary? Or another way to look at it is, are they fat? Their environment was toxic for one reason. Our environment